The airport smelled of coffee, jet fuel, and reunions. I remember standing on tiptoes, my heart pounding, scanning the crowd for my brother. Months had felt like years since he'd left, and in that moment, I was just a 24-year-old girl desperate to see family again. My name is Emily, and I had no idea that the mistake I made in that crowded terminal would change everything I thought I knew about love, betrayal, and fate. I saw a tall silhouette, broad shoulders, dark hair, the shape so familiar I didn't even hesitate. I rushed forward, weaving through the sea of strangers, and without thinking, I threw my arms around him. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," I whispered into his chest. But as soon as I felt how firm he was, how he smelled of expensive cologne instead of my brother's cheap deodorant, I realized something was horribly wrong. When I lifted my head, my stomach dropped. The man I was hugging wasn't my brother. He wasn't even a stranger you could easily dismiss. He looked like he had walked out of a magazine, his suit perfectly tailored, his hair neatly styled, his features sharp and intimidating. And his eyes, storm gray, piercing amused, were locked on me. I stumbled back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I'm so sorry, I stammered, my face burning. "I thought you were my brother." Wrong angle, wrong reflection. Emotional nearsightedness. He raised one eyebrow and the corner of his mouth twitched. Emotional nearsightedness. Yes, when your heart outruns your common sense, I blurted, wishing the ground would swallow me whole. Before he could reply, a massive man in a black suit appeared beside him. "Mr. Carter, is everything okay?" My breath caught. Carter. My brain scrambled. Brian Carter. The Carter. The billionaire everyone whispered about but rarely saw. I had just thrown myself into his arms like some desperate fangirl, except I wasn't one. I was just a broke girl who worked in an airport cafe and barely scraped together enough to support my younger brother Oliver. And now I had made a fool of myself in front of one of the richest men alive. My humiliation burned hotter when I realized he was smiling. "Are you afraid of billionaires?" he asked softly, crossing his arms, watching me flounder. "No," I muttered. "I'm afraid of ending up on a security camera meme and moving to Alaska to hide." He chuckled, but I didn't stay to hear it. I ran. I ran as if running could erase the fact that his eyes had already seen too much of me. But fate, as I would learn, is not easily outrun. The next time I saw Brian Carter, I was behind the counter at the cafe wearing a stained apron and a fake smile. My manager barked my name, ordering me to deliver a special order to table 12. When I walked over, tray in hand, my breath stopped. It was him, sitting like he owned the world, because in some ways he did. "Well, look at that," he said, his voice smooth, teasing. "We meet again." I nearly dropped the tray. "You?" "Yes, me," he replied, his gray eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. Heat rose in my cheeks, but I forced a polite smile. "Here's your order. Have a nice day." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Do you always run away this fast?" I froze, my apron strings twisting in my hands. He wasn't just handsome, he was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence. He had the kind of presence that made you question your own boundaries, your own walls. I told myself it was a coincidence that billionaires didn't remember waitresses, that he'd forget me the moment his coffee cooled. But I was wrong. He kept coming back. Day after day, same table, same order, same gray eyes that followed me across the cafe like I was some puzzle he intended to solve. My boss noticed, my coworkers whispered, and I hated the attention. I wanted him to stop. I wanted him to keep coming. The day he asked me to dinner, I laughed in his face. "Why on earth would I go anywhere with you?" "Because you want to," he said, simply scribbling an address on a napkin. 8 p.m. "If you don't show, I'll assume you're afraid of me." I almost tore the napkin in half. Almost. But at 7:59 the next night, I was standing outside that restaurant, my hands shaking, my heart screaming at me to turn back. And yet I went in. That dinner changed everything. Brian Carter wasn't what I expected. He wasn't all arrogance and ego. He listened. He laughed. He told me stories about his childhood, about traveling, about feeling suffocated by the very wealth others envied. And for the first time in years, I laughed too. When he draped his jacket over my shoulders as we walked outside, I hated that my heart skipped. I hated that I didn't want to give it back. But just as quickly as I began to trust him, the world reminded me why I shouldn't. Because beneath his charm was a truth I hadn't uncovered yet. A truth that would rip open old wounds. reveal secrets buried by time and money, and leave me questioning whether this man who made me feel seen had also destroyed the very foundation of my past. And when I learned that truth, I would have to decide whether to forgive or to let betrayal turn into the revenge I never thought myself capable of. I told myself not to fall for him, not to confuse kindness with love, not to let his money blur the edges of reality. But the more time I spent with Brian Carter, the more impossible it became to keep my walls intact. He had this way of making me feel like the only person in a crowded room, and I hated how much I craved that. For a girl who had spent most of her life invisible, dismissed, or pitied, being seen so intensely felt like fire against frozen skin. We started seeing each other in secret. I never told Oliver, my younger brother, because he would never understand. He'd call me reckless, accuse me of selling myself for comfort, of betraying the values Mom raised us with before she died. And maybe in some twisted way he would be right. Because there were nights I looked at Brian's mansion, at the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, and I wondered if I was falling in love with him or with the life he represented. But then there were moments too raw to ignore. The night he showed me the scar on his wrist, a remnant of an accident no tabloid ever mentioned. The way he admitted he still had nightmares about being powerless as a child in a house where money bought silence but not safety. His secrets made him real. His pain mirrored mine. And I started to believe that maybe fate hadn't just played a cruel trick when I mistook him for my brother that day. It had handed me the one person who could understand me. Until the cracks appeared. It started small. Whispers from coworkers that billionaires never give without taking. A headline I saw on my manager's phone about Carter family scandals. And then one evening, when I arrived at Brian's estate for dinner, I overheard something I was never supposed to hear. His aunt, a sharp-eyed woman draped in pearls, said, "Does she even know who her father is? Or that yours had a hand in ruining her family?" I froze outside the doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. She knew me. She knew something about my past, something Brian hadn't told me. My father had abandoned us when I was young, leaving my mother to raise me and Oliver alone. She never spoke his name again. It was a wound so deep, I built my life around ignoring it. And now, hearing that the Carter family was somehow connected to his betrayal made me feel like I was standing on a floor about to give way. When I confronted Brian later that night, his face gave him away before his lips did. "Emily, please," he said, reaching for me. "I was going to tell you, I just needed time." Tell me what. My voice cracked. "That my father." He swallowed hard. "My father's company was the reason your family lost everything. Your father, he wasn't just absent, he was destroyed, and it was my family's doing." It felt like the air left my lungs. Every laugh we had shared, every moment I had let myself believe in him, twisted into a knife. My mother's endless exhaustion. The eviction notices, the nights Oliver and I went hungry. Suddenly, they all pointed back to the man standing in front of me and the blood that ran through his veins. I wanted to scream, to strike him, to collapse. Instead, I whispered, "So all along, I was falling in love with the son of the man who ruined my life." His silence was the cruelest confirmation. That night I left his house and swore I would never return. I felt foolish, broken, like I had walked willingly into the arms of my enemy. But pain has a way of sharpening into purpose. And in that storm of betrayal, something inside me hardened. If the Carter family had taken everything from mine once, they would not take me too, not without a fight. Revenge didn't come naturally to me. I was a girl who bandaged wounds, not inflicted them, but sometimes survival means learning to wound back. And as I lay awake in my small apartment, Oliver sleeping soundly in the next room, I decided I would uncover every secret the Carters buried, every crime money had silenced. I would make them face the truth the way they had forced me to. What I didn't know then was that my revenge would not just destroy the man who broke me, it would uncover a family secret so shocking it would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. I spent the following weeks walking around like a ghost. At work, I poured coffee, wiped counters, smiled at customers, but inside I was burning. My coworkers whispered about how pale I looked, but I didn't care. My nights were spent digging, piecing together fragments of my mother's past, my father's disappearance, and every breadcrumb that led back to the Carter empire. I started with the public records. Old newspapers, dusty archives, online forums where forgotten scandals lived like cobwebs. The story was there buried in footnotes and whispers. My father had been an employee at Carter Enterprises, one of the most trusted, until one deal ruined him. He'd been accused of embezzlement charges that had never made sense. My mother always insisted he was innocent, but the shame crushed him. He walked out one night and never came back. Some said he ran, some said he was silenced. And the name at the center of it all, Brian's father. I couldn't breathe when I read it. My hands shook as if holding proof of a curse. My father was not a monster. He was a scapegoat. And the Carters had been the ones to destroy him, to take everything from us. That night I confronted Brian again. I didn't plan to, but he found me outside the cafe waiting like a shadow I couldn't escape. He looked different, haunted, sleepless. Emily, please, let me explain. I wanted to walk away, but anger rooted me there. Explain how your family framed mine, how your father buried the truth and left my family to starve. His face twisted not with arrogance, but with shame. You don't understand my father. He made enemies. He destroyed people. And I've spent my life trying to undo the damage he caused. His voice broke. I didn't know it was your family. I swear I didn't know until I looked deeper. Until you. But it was too late. Even if he hadn't known, the blood on his family's hands was real. And the worst part, I could see in his eyes that he truly cared for me. That he wanted to save me, to love me. But how do you love the man who carries the name that ruined yours? I turned away, whispering, you should have stayed a stranger in the airport. It would have hurt less. The days blurred after that. Brian kept trying. Letters slipped under my door flowers, left on the cafe counter. His gray eyes searching for mine whenever our paths crossed. But I refused. Not because I didn't feel the pull, but because I felt it too much. And every pull reminded me of chains. Then came the night that changed everything. I was going through my mother's box again, fingers tracing over brittle papers, when I found something I had missed before, a letter folded deep inside an envelope marked with my father's handwriting. My chest tightened as I opened it. His words spilled out raw and desperate. He wrote about how he had discovered corruption in Carter Enterprises, illegal deals, forged contracts, and how he had been set up when he threatened to expose it. He wrote that he loved us, that he wanted to protect us, but that powerful people had made sure he couldn't stay. At the bottom of the letter, a line chilled me to the bone. If anything happens to me, don't trust the Carters. But don't lose yourself in hating them either. Tears blurred the ink. For years I thought my father had abandoned us. Now I knew he had been silenced by the very family whose son I had fallen in love with. And yet, the last line haunted me. Don't lose yourself in hating them. The next time Brian came to see me, I was ready, not with forgiveness, but with a demand. If you truly care about me, prove it. Help me expose your father. Help me get justice for mine. His eyes widened, a storm brewing behind them. Emily, if I do that, it will destroy everything. My family, my legacy. Your legacy was built on blood. I cut in, my voice trembling but steady. If you want me, if you want redemption, then help me burn it down. The silence between us was heavy, but in it I saw the truth. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was his too. I didn't know then that by opening that door, I was walking into a war that would test every piece of me, my love, my loyalty, my strength. And when the final secret surfaced, it wouldn't just be about my father or his. It would be about us. When we decided to fight, there was no cinematic montage, no neat sequence of triumphant music and paperwork falling into place. There were late nights, hunched over a laptop in my tiny kitchen, the glow of the screen painting Oliver's toys blue on the table, where I spread out maps of bank transfers and scanned memos. There were whispered phone calls with anonymous tips, meetings in parking garages, with people who slid envelopes across greasy tabletops like contraband. There was fear, the kind that lives in your throat and makes your hands shake when you sign a non-disclosure you don't trust. There was also Brian, no longer the distant, teasing billionaire of the cafe, but a man who showed up at 3 a.m. with coffee and folders, who answered questions in court with his voice steady and small, who slept in the chair across from my bed sometimes because the fight had become ours. We found a whistleblower first, a former acquisitions manager who had quietly left the Carter Empire a decade before, disgusted and bankrupted by what he'd seen. He brought ledgers, handwritten notes, coded entries, transfers routed through shell companies that led straight to the deals that destroyed my parents' restaurant. Every page felt like a hand on my chest squeezing. The pattern was there: coercion, deliberate bankruptcy, forged invoices to push owners into selling for pennies. Names I'd only seen in print officers with veneers of respectability were in the margins, scrawled next to dollar amounts, as if moral language had never belonged in their world. Brian did something I'll never forget. He handed the ledgers to me first. "You should read this before anyone else," he said. His fingers brushed mine when he passed the folder, and for a second, we were just two people in a kitchen, lit by a single bulb, everything else stripped away. I cried then, not because of evidence, but because here, it was the truth I'd waited for, heavy and terrible and finally mine to hold. We took it to the one place powerful families dread: publicity, backed by lawyers who wouldn't be bullied. The papers ran the story with the force of a storm. Carter Enterprises denied as expected, lawsuits were filed, Twitter exploded with old victims resurfacing. The board that once fortified itself against scrutiny cracked when more executives afraid of indictment turned witness. In hearings that smelled of polished wood and old money, I sat with my mother's letter in my lap and watched Brian stand up and say what needed to be said: that he would relinquish control, that he would not hide behind his name, that the company that bore his family's brand would be made to account for what it did to people like mine. His admission cost him. There were late-night calls from people who had called him son and heir, and who now labeled him traitor. He lost his position, his privileges, the protective layers that had once made him untouchable. I watched the press as they tried to break him. The papers that had once praised his charm now mocked him. And yet, he never wavered. If anything, his resolve hardened into something protective and honest. He had traded legacy for the possibility of us being whole. The legal settlement was not a fairy tale payday. Justice is messy. It is made of restitution checks that don't erase sleepless years of apologies that land like small stones in a river and eventually smooth into something like healing. But the deed to our restaurant was returned, the ledgers documented the lies, and several executives faced charges. The Carter name, once untouchable, had to answer questions in courts and in headlines. For my family, it meant a chance to rebuild not just a restaurant, but dignity. When the doors reopened, the smell of simmering stock and fresh bread felt like the answer to a prayer. Oliver ran through the dining room with a mop of hair and a grin that had lost the shadow of fear. Customers came not just to eat, but to witness something reborn. People who months before had seen us as victims began to see us as people with stamina and scars that mapped our strength. I worked the pass in an apron that had been washed until the fabric softened, and when I looked up, Brian stood in the doorway watching hands shoved into the pockets of a sweater, not a suit. He smiled in a way that made the room seem smaller, more intimate, as if the feud outside could not find us here. We did marry quietly, surrounded by the stubborn few who had loved and held us through the chaos: Oliver, the whistleblower who had become like an uncle, a handful of colleagues who had watched us choose courage. Our vows were less about promises of forever and more about the work of loving someone who is always a work in progress. I didn't marry vengeance. I married a man who had chosen truth over comfort, who had been willing to dismantle his inheritance to right a wrong. That choice did more to convince me than any grand gesture ever could. And yet what I learned in the storm didn't change the fact that truth can be lonely. There were nights when the hurt resurfaced, the grocery receipt that still bore the margin notes. My mother had scrawled the memory of a child's small hand reaching for food that wasn't there. There were days when I felt guilty for the life Brian's fall cost him, when I questioned whether our love had simply been the last refuge in a landscape of ruin. Those doubts are not dramatic, they are human. They are what come after the headlines when you are sitting with a cup of tea and the city is indifferent. If there is a lesson in all this, it isn't that revenge is sweet, or that love redeems everything. Its narrower and truer truth frees you in ways vengeance never will. But truth asks for courage, courage to face what you lose and what you might gain. I learned that exposing lies can restore a life, but it can't replace the years that were taken. I learned that people are not only what they inherit, but also what they decide to do with those inheritances. And I learned that choosing someone who risks everything for right, who would rather be shamed than shielded by a lie, is a braver act than any dramatic stand I could have made alone. So if you take anything away from my story, let it be this. Hold tight to the people who show up in small ways when the world tries to be loud. Tell the truth when it scares you. Fight when staying quiet would make you complicit. And remember that healing is slow but persistent. It is the stirring of broth on a cold morning, the first loaf that comes out of an oven after years of dust. It is quiet, it is steady, and it will outlast the headlines. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps voices like mine be heard. Leave a comment below if you ever had to choose between silence and the truth. I read everyone and they mean more than you know.